So I want to welcome everyone. Good morning. I want to thank the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies for inviting me here, and Jaime Suchlicki and his staff for putting together, organizing this event. My paper is, my presentation is really derived from a greater research project that we're doing with regards to the changes in Cuban agriculture and in the Cuban emerging non-state sector. So rather than talk about Cuban agriculture as I normally do, I ventured out and I said, well, let me talk a little bit about recent research that we are doing regarding self-employment or the emerging registered self-employment workers in Cuba. So basically, I'll talk about the policy measures to extend self-employment in Cuba from the period of 2009 to 2011, 2012. Then I'll present some very brief data, and of course this is just the surface of the data that I gathered in my research about the evolution of self-employment in Cuba, and then I'll summarize the principal challenges confronting self-employed workers in Cuba. So there are constraints to the topic in the sense that I'm concentrating on the data that pertains to only the registered self-employed workers. In essence, if you look at the policy measures, and I have a lot of information on this first slide. So if you look at the policy measures, there are basically 9 policy measures that are the most significant ones, right? The first one has to do with increasing the number of people that can, or the number of activities that could be qualified as self-employed activities. So what I wanted to say about the first one is if you look at it, right, it's a significant change from self-employment policies from the 1970s, from the 1990s during the special period. But you could see an emphasis on quantity, not quality. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I looked at all the different categories of self-employment activities that are legalized in Cuba. And about 80% of those are relatively low value-added categories. So we're talking about categories like, I'll say it in Spanish and I'll try to translate it into English in what I think is the English translation, reparador de fosforera, right? So that's somebody who repairs, lighters that we throw away here, right? So reparador de fosforera, enrollador de bobinas, somebody who is like a mechanic or something that will take a bobina, which is sort of like an electrical engine, and will recoil that engine. I mean, think about recoiling an engine, right, as a way to economic prosperity. So the point is that you have a significant increase in the, and I'll show you this shortly, a significant increase in the number of self-employed workers, which is very good, but it's an emphasis on quality rather than quantity. If you look at some of the other measures that I have listed here, for example, self-employed workers can now, like cooperatives, they can sell their output to the state. But so that sounds like they're free to sell their output to the state. But the truth is that the state retains the bargaining power when it comes to those transactions. Another measure is that self-employed workers can lease retail outlets from the state. When I first read about that, and this is basically the creation of cooperatives, of second-degree cooperatives, retail-based cooperatives, and of course they began with, again, low value-added activities, right? So you had barbers and beauty shops and things like that used to work for the state. Now leasing the retail outlet from the state and offering their services, and somebody, and I can really not tell you who it was, came up with the brilliant idea that if we form a cooperative, and let's say all of us here are barbers, right, as opposed to academics and so on, and we say, okay, wonderful, we're going to form a cooperative and we're going to lease this place from the state. So in that case, Jaime would be the state. Somebody said, well, each one of you can only have 2 chairs. That's it. You can only operate 2 spots, basically. And so there are constraints, there are inner contradictions to the way that this model is being reformed. The other thing that I found in my much more profound research about this was that leasing retail properties from the state doesn't mean that they're ready for the consumption of the intermediate producer, meaning that some of those properties that were being leased or sort of rented out to the emerging cuentapropistas or self-employed, some of those properties are in terrible state of disrepair. And I was in Havana recently, and I seen some of those properties with my own eyes, and some of them are really in terrible condition. So it will take a lot of capital. Of course, these people are improvising, right? But nonetheless, it is a change from the old system where the state had ownership. But something else I wanted to say, clarify about this, is that the state retains the ownership of these properties, right? So it's a leasing contract, but it doesn't really signify the transfer of private property rights. Okay. Some other measures, and I'll go through them a little bit quickly here, is that pluriempleo, multiple opportunities for employment. And I think that is very significant. If you study the Cuban labor market and the structure of the labor market or the restructuring since 1959, pluriempleo was not permissible, at least legally. We know that it existed in the underground economy, but it wasn't permitted legally. Other that you can read here are basically that self-employed workers can hire other workers as subcontractors. So I could be a self-employed worker, and I could work for somebody else who's a self-employed micro-entrepreneur, and I'll talk about taxes and all that shortly, but that person, that's permissible, okay? That is permissible. So you're looking at a model where there has been an expansion, to self-employment regulation, but I wanted to, and I literally did a sort of a back of the envelope. I don't have it's not in my PowerPoint, it's here, on the way here this morning, and I wanted to say, well, what are the reasons? Something I did not put on my presentation, which I do have on my research paper, is what are the reasons for these reforms? And I think most of you are familiar with the reasons, and the reasons are, the principal reason, of course, is the inflated payrolls, the inflated numbers in the state sector. And so I looked at the data that was published by Cuba, and when the announcement was made to restructure the labor market, right, by transferring more people from the state sector to the non-state sector, they were saying that from about 1.3 to 2 million or 1.8 million people would be transferred in order to make the state sector more efficient. We're talking about 26% to 40% of those that are employed. And by the way, that includes the entire labor force. So it was the employed and the unemployed. But as you know, the second reason was Cuba has a very low unemployment rate, an open unemployment rate of 1.3, 1.2 on average. If you average it out for the last 15 years, it comes out to around 1.6%. But behind that, it's a high degree of sub-employment, of underemployment of resources. And the government knew this. And so it was a way to move people out of the state sector. And what better way to do it, right, they thought, than to promote something so wonderful called, self-employment, micro-entrepreneurship. And they didn't use the word micro-entrepreneurship, but promoting the expansion of the state sector. So let me show you where we are so far. And if you look at the data, well, of course, total employment has been, if you look at the top line of the data, total employment in Cuba has been reduced by 3.36%. And by the way, I'm looking at data, this is very limited data from 2009 to 2012. They haven't published yet the data for 2013. So what are the reasons? And the reasons for that decline in total employment are demographic, immigration, and people retiring. So demographic, and immigration. Those are the reasons, right? Now, if you look at the state sector, the decline in the absolute numbers in the state sector are much larger, right? They're about 4 times larger than the decline in total employment. So we're looking at the state sector contracting for about 13.3%. So a little over 500,000 workers leaving the state sector, okay? Some of those are immigration, some of those are, people who retired, obviously, and, of course, demographics, also the contraction of the state sector, the absolute contraction of the state sector. And then you look at the state sector, the non-state sector, and there you see the expansion, and the growth there is around 48%, so about a 50% growth rate. The real number is a little larger than this number here, but these are the official numbers, okay? So I also have here the expansion of the non-state sector by category. And earlier this morning, I was speaking with someone, and we were talking about cooperatives and how the government officially says, well, cooperatives are the preferred method to transform the labor market because cooperatives represent a property form with a greater degree of socialization, or social property, of the socialization of property. So the government perspective is that cooperatives, not self-employment, should be the way to transform the labor market. Well, the numbers show that it's really not working out that way, right? The amount of people working in cooperatives has declined by about 8% for the period that I studied. Okay, now if you look at the private sector, right, the private sector is mostly comprised of farmers, individual farmers who are neither cooperativistas nor are they self-employed workers. So they're a category. And then it also includes an estimate for people that are neither, that are called desvinculados. They have no formal ties to any, employer, whether state, non-state, cooperative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that private sector has expanded quite significantly, okay? And then you have the self-employed workers, which are included in the private sector category, but also segregated from the, for accounting for statistical purposes. And if you look at the number of self-employed workers, it has increased by over 181%. So there's a story about the self-employed workers. And then I present you the ratios of self-employed workers as a total. So as a percentage of total back in 2009, there were about 2.8, let's say 3%, which has been the historical average since the 1990s. That number has increased to about 8.25% in 2012. Now, self-employed workers, and as a percentage of non-state workers, right? Everyone on the non-state sector has increased from about 17 to 33%. And then you look at self-employed workers as a percentage of private sector, of the private sector category. And then that has increased from 24% to 40%. There's a lot more data that I don't show you here, but I'll tell you a couple of pointers really quickly. I looked at the gender distribution in the labor force. And what I find is that females are underrepresented as self-employed workers. So self-employment, legally registered self-employment in Cuba is mostly a male story. Most of the entrepreneurs are male. That's one thing that I found. Of course, females and the gender ratio in the state sector is pretty much equal, right? Which is a reflection of the Cuban population. But females in the cooperative sector represent a higher percentage, and there's a reason for that, right? And the reason is, of course, that if you look at the category of cooperatives in Cuba, it includes the UBPCs, the basic units for agricultural production, la UBPC, no? And so most of the directors, most of the technicians, and so on, there are females. So that explains the disproportionate gender representation of females in the cooperative sector. So the data has a story on the surface. There's a lot more data than this, but again, I know I have 15 minutes, so I'll be very economical with the data. So I wanted to talk about some of the principal challenges, right? Because if I go back to that slide one moment again, it seems like the story has worked. It seems like you have a decrease in the state sector employment, you have an increase in the non-state sector, and the success story there is a self-employed workers, right? So it seems like it's a success story, but the reality is quite different. They're facing a lot of constraints. Of all the constraints, of course, the most significant one is the tax system. And it's a very convoluted and complicated tax system. On the way here, I was reading the Decree Law 298. And I had to read it a couple of times. And I almost had a cocktail on the plane. It gave me a headache reading it because I was looking for things that I missed here that I needed to tell you. But I think I captured most of the important things. So you have a 10% tax on sales on goods. That's not very onerous, is it? 10%? Well, it's not, by global standards, it's not so significant. But then you get into the other taxes. You get into a tax on the utilization of labor. And my calculation, and these are just numbers from the back of the envelope, is, you can see it on the PowerPoint, my calculations are there. You're talking about on average, about 2,000 pesos per worker per year. That's a significant amount of money for micro-entrepreneurship. And then for income taxes, they get more creative, because for income taxes, they have the simplified tax system and the regular tax system. And so, for example, if you look at some workers who pay taxes under the general tax system, average income taxes are going to range from about 40 to 70 pesos per month on average. And here you can see the tax base. I wrote a little formula for the tax base, which is basically total revenue minus deductible, a deductible amount. And I'll talk about the deductible amount now. But the point is, when you look at the tax system, it really builds on taxes upon taxes upon taxes. So the idea is basically to not to encourage the entrepreneurship, but the idea is basically to use the expansion of self-employed work labor as a way to increase the collections of taxes by the state. And I think that when I move to the next slide, that will become more obvious. Look at the progressive tax regime. What I didn't include here was the deductions, and the deductions are pretty much fixed. And by the way, there's a whole issue with the deductions and paying taxes, and people who go to the office of the ONAT, Oficina Nacional de Administración Tributaria, and they want to pay their taxes, and they're told, we don't have the ink to give you the seal, so come back next month and you owe more taxes because you didn't pay your taxes on time. Imagine we did that to the IRS. We said, well, we'll file the taxes and they can process the tax filing. So the taxes on services, but the one that I found very interesting there is the 25% contribution for Social Security, right? For the Seguridad Social. It ranges from about 350 to 2,000 pesos. I wrote in there that it's paid by the employer if you hire somebody, but it's also paid by the employee. So you have a way to capture more taxes. This is, by the way, I'm just touching the tax system on the surface. There's so much detail that I decided to write an entire research paper on the tax system. Nobody has really looked at it very closely yet. There are taxes and there are exceptions. For example, if you take somebody who is a cuentapropista, self-employed worker, and that person is renting part of their house, not the entire house, a room in the house. A room, if the room has a bathroom, there's a different tax system applied to it. If the room has a bathroom and a kitchen, like an efficiency unit here in Miami has a different tax system applied to it. Now people can also rent their entire houses, and then the tax system is very different applied to them. Construction workers have to do a different. The great thing is that Cuba has, well, I say that, for research purposes, the great thing is that Cuba has basically published a very detailed tax table. It looks very medieval to me, like if you do this, we'll tax this, and we'll, so that's really meritorious of writing a research paper and trying to decipher it and doing a case study. So the first constraint is basically a tax system that is very onerous. I wish I had more time to give you more details on it, but by all measures, it's there as a way to confiscate that limited prosperity that these people are generating. The second, so I summarized it to 7. How much time do I? Okay, all right. Boy. So the second is an undeveloped banking system. And when I mean an undeveloped banking system, I don't mean only the lack of internet access and things like that. I mean the capacity of the banking system not to understand financial products, okay? The third one, I'll be one more minute. The third one is that the input markets, right? There's no input markets really where these people can go and buy goods in Cuban pesos at prices that are reasonable. As an economist, the only reasonable price that I believe in is a market price, right? So there's no such thing. Then you have a government monopoly on imports, foreign investment, joint ventures, and so on. I think some of the other speakers this morning will talk more about that. Number 5 is one that I found by doing field work, which is basically there's not enough spaces where people can, even if they want to rent a business, even if I want to be a micro-entrepreneur and I want to rent a retail space, there isn't enough space. And so, as you know, the government has cracked down on the renting of houses, porches and things like that to do retail, establishments. So state-owned facilities are in a terrible state of disrepair. I jumped the number, I skipped 6, but the final one is a business climate that's still hostile. So you have depressed purchasing power by the Cuban population, which is a huge problem. Regardless of remittances, still on a comparative basis, their purchasing power is very low. You have the lack of capital accumulation to do new business ventures, limited microcredit, microfinance, prohibitions against methods that are used to raise capital. I teach a course on entrepreneurship, and we spend the entire semester learning about methods for raising capital and doing joint ventures and doing private capital and collateralized lending and so on, and that doesn't happen. Of course, limited property rights, that's a huge problem. We all know that. And the final one, in that hostile business climate, I think it's the state, which is ambivalent, right? And it's undergoing what I think Janos Kornai coined very well in his research about Hungary, these inner contradictions of reform, if we can call that, of reform socialism, where the state is ambivalent in terms of their policies and their views towards the emerging sector. It's a love-hate affair towards the emerging sector. And finally, of course, the fact that the lack of resources that the government has. So just to conclude, it looks, in absolute numbers like self-employment is a great story, but there are many, many, many challenges that are affecting that sector of the Cuban economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mario. Just an observation before we turn it over to Dr. Quijano. I think a fascinating statistic that Mario just provided us with is that 8% of the workforce is now self-employed. As he was talking, I was sort of recollecting that the self-employment categories are precisely 181 activities. It was 178, and they added 3 activities, all of which are repairing umbrellas, refilling. One of them is to be a dandy. That is now permitted to be a dandy. So I guess a question for later on would be, what does it say about the future prospect of an economy when the number of people employed in being dandies is increasing? I don't think it speaks very well to the future, so we'll talk about that. Mario? Carlos, perdón.